Welcome to the Sleep Hours, the only place where cartoons fall asleep before you do. So grab your blanket, tuck in your favorite plushie, and let's get weird. Today's story is about the girl and the silent spirit. It's about a voiceless spirit and a broken-hearted girl find healing in each other's silent companionship. In a forgotten corner of the world, far from the noise of cities and the warmth of laughter, there stood a village wrapped in stillness. It was the kind of place where time moved slowly, where houses leaned a little too far into their own shadows, and where lanterns swayed quietly even on windless nights. At the edge of this hushed place, in a small, crumbling house overtaken by vines and dust, lived a little girl named Eera. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply existed. Like the whisper of a memory no one dared to remember. The villagers said she had once been different, bright, curious, always chasing birds and skipping stones across the creek. But that was before the night the light left her home forever. The night her family disappeared without a trace. No goodbyes, no answers, just gone. They say the wind howled strangely that evening, that every candle in town snuffed out at once, and that when the sun rose, only Eera remained, standing at her front door, barefoot, shivering with wide, empty eyes. From that moment on, the village changed. Whispers grew like weeds, soft at first, then sharp and cruel. Curse, they said. Strange things happen around that girl. Children were told to cross the street when they saw her. Mothers pulled their little ones close. Doors closed a little too quickly when her footsteps echoed down the cobblestone. And so silence settled into her bones. Eera stopped going to school. The books in her home gathered dust. She learned to listen to the sounds others ignored, the creak of the floorboards as the house breathed, the flutter of moths against glass, the way trees murmured in the evening wind. These sounds became her only companions. Each day bled into the next. Seasons changed, and yet nothing truly shifted in her world. She'd wake with the birds, feed the tiny sparrows that dared to land near her window, then wander the overgrown garden with bare feet and blank eyes. Sometimes she'd find old photographs, faded pictures of smiles she could no longer feel. Other times she'd lie in the grass, staring at the sky, wondering where the clouds went when they vanished. She spoke to no one, and no one spoke to her. The house, once alive with voices and laughter, had grown hollow. Its walls remembered but offered no comfort. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the stillness. Even the warmth of sunlight through the windows felt distant, unable to reach her skin. But Eera didn't cry. Not anymore. Grief had frozen inside her, thick and unmoving, like winter that overstayed its welcome. At night, the quiet became heavier, lonelier. The moonlight painted pale patterns on the wooden floor, and the stars outside blinked like distant eyes, watching but never answering. And every now and then, lying beneath a patchwork quilt that no longer smelled like home, she would whisper to the dark, "Just one word, please." And the darkness never replied. But on this night, this one quiet, aching night, something was different. The wind carried no chill. The usual creaks of the house seemed to pause as if holding their breath. Outside her window, the trees stood utterly still, their branches frozen in mid-sway. The world, for just a moment, was listening. Eera sat up slowly, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of a dying candle. Her eyes, gray like storm clouds, reflected nothing. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin atop them, and looked out across the sleeping village. She didn't know why the sadness felt sharper tonight. Perhaps the silence was too thick, or perhaps, deep inside, something had begun to stir, a need, faint and forgotten. For all the years that had passed, for all the empty days and even emptier nights, she had never truly asked. But now, in the hush between dreams and waking, her heart cracked just enough to let a wish escape. Softly. So softly, it might have gone unheard. Just one friend. And though she didn't know it yet, the night heard her. Outside her window, the sky had deepened into a velvet black, pinpricked with stars that shimmered faintly, like memories barely remembered. The moon hung low and full, its pale light spilling across the wooden floor of her bedroom, painting quiet shapes on the walls. Everything was still. Not even the crickets sang. And in that stillness, something shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. It was more like the feeling of walking into a room and sensing you're no longer alone. A hush that drew closer, not with footsteps, but with a presence, like fog slowly curling its way beneath a closed door. Eera didn't notice at first. She was lying on her side now, eyes wide open, facing the window. Her breath was quiet, soft, steady. But something in the room had changed. The air had thickened, like it held something waiting, watching. Then, without warning, the flickering candle beside her bed went out. Not from a breeze, not from a touch, just gone. 1 second it burned. The next, it didn't. Eera sat up slowly. Her eyes moved toward the corner of the room. There was nothing there. Nothing she could see. But she felt it. A coolness, subtle yet undeniable. Like the ghost of wind against her cheek, or the moment before a dream begins. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the quilt. The worn fabric clutched against her chest. She wasn't afraid. Not exactly. It had been so long since she'd felt anything. The flicker of unease was almost welcome. Like something had finally knocked on the door she had long shut tight. She whispered again. Not to the room this time, but to herself. Please? And then a sound. A sound so faint it might have been imagined. Like cloth brushing against wood. Like footsteps that didn't quite touch the floor. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned, In the far corner of a room where moonlight barely reached, something moved. Not fast. Not aggressive, just shifted. Her heart thudded gently, not in panic, but in quiet wonder. The shape was tall and dark, almost blending into the wall itself. No eyes, no face, just a faint outline, barely formed, like shadow wrapped in silence. The figure didn't speak. It didn't reach out. It simply remained. Its presence quiet but undeniable. Eera blinked once, then twice. The shape didn't vanish. It was real. Somehow, impossibly, someone or something had come. She sat perfectly still, her body tense, her mind racing, yet deep down, beneath the pulse in her ears and the tremble in her fingertips, there was no fear, only an aching, trembling question. Are you here? For me? The figure didn't move. But it didn't leave. It stayed. Long minutes passed. The silence thickened again, but this time it felt different. Not empty, but full. Like it had meaning, like it had heard her. And that, more than anything, unraveled something inside her. For the first time in what felt like 100 lifetimes, Eera felt noticed. Not by the villagers who turned their backs, not by the skies that watched from far above, but by something else, something that listened, something silent. She laid back slowly, her head sinking into the worn pillow, her eyes never leaving the shape in the shadows. The moonlight shifted across the room. The darkness didn't move. Neither did she. There were no words between them. But somehow in that silence, something had spoken louder than sound ever could. Eera closed her eyes, not in fear, not in escape, but in quiet trust. Maybe, just maybe, the night had answered. The hours passed slowly, the way they only do when something strange has happened. Something too delicate to name. Outside, the village slumbered on, unaware that within the quietest house on the hill, a girl and a ghost were no longer alone. Eera didn't sleep. Not fully. Her body rested, still and calm beneath her thin quilt, but her mind floated gently, like a leaf on the surface of a quiet stream. She was no stranger to long nights, but this one felt different. It wasn't haunted by memory or pierced by loneliness. It was simply full. The presence in the corner didn't leave. It didn't inch closer, didn't vanish with the rising moon. It simply remained, a quiet echo in the room, as steady as breath, as soft as shadow. Sometimes, Eera peeked through her lashes, just to make sure it was still there. It always was. And so, little by little, the fear she hadn't allowed herself to feel, the fear of being seen, of being known, began to unravel, like a knot pulled gently by unseen fingers. Her limbs relaxed. Her hands loosened their grip on the quilt. Her breath deepened. It was strange, she thought, how comforting it felt. Being watched by something that made no demands, no judgments. It didn't ask her to smile. It didn't ask her to explain. It didn't try to fix her. It just stayed. And for someone who had been abandoned without reason, that meant everything. The first pale blush of morning hadn't yet touched the sky when she whispered into the darkness again. Not a plea, not a question. Just a name. Eera, she said softly, as if reminding the world she still existed. That's me. The shadow didn't respond. But somehow, she felt the stillness shift. Not with surprise, but with acknowledgement. Like it had been waiting for her to offer that truce. In her own time, in her own way. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was warm. And so she continued. I don't remember much from before. Not anymore, she murmured. Faces, sounds, even their voices. They slip away when I try to hold them. A pause. My mother had a braid down her back, I think. She used to hum. I can't remember the tune, but sometimes I hear it when I'm dreaming. She smiled faintly. It was not the kind of smile that comes from joy, but the soft, aching curve of someone brushing against memory. Eera sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile moment. People think I'm cursed, she whispered. They say the night they vanished, something unnatural happened. Maybe they're right. Maybe I broke something. Or maybe I was just the one who got left behind. Still, the figure didn't move. But the shadows around it seemed to grow gentler, like clouds drifting apart to let a little light through. She tilted her head, studying it with the quiet wonder of a child who's been given a story she's not sure she deserves. You're not like the things they fear, she said. You're quiet, but not empty. Outside, the first bird of morning chirped, a sound so soft, so fragile, it felt like a secret slipping through the cracks of the world. Eera turned her head toward the window, watching the blue-gray glow of dawn begin to edge over the horizon. The village rooftops remained still, cloaked in the sleepy hush of early morning. Chimneys cold, doors closed. Yet inside her small, forgotten room, something had begun. Not loudly, not suddenly, but like the earliest light of day, unfolding slowly, almost shyly, after a long, endless night. She looked back to the figure in the corner. It hadn't left. It hadn't spoken. But somehow she no longer needed it to. In the stillness between her words, in the space between breath and shadow, a kind of understanding had formed, one deeper than language, older than grief. I think you heard me last night, she said softly. when I wished for a friend. A pause. And I think you came. Her voice cracked on the last word. Not from sadness, but from something far more delicate, something that had long gone missing. Hope. The word curled around her like the edges of a warm blanket. Not big, not overwhelming. Just enough. Just possible. She lowered her head again, curling into herself as the golden edge of dawn began to spill across the floorboards. Her eyelids fluttered. The weight of the long night finally began to release her. And as her breathing slowed, a faint, almost imperceptible thing happened. The shadow in the corner moved. Not toward her, but closer, just enough. It settled beside the edge of her bed, silent as ever, but present. And that was enough. Eera drifted into sleep, not with the heaviness of someone escaping the world, but with the softness of someone being carried, lightly, carefully, into a place where dreams were no longer hollow. And still, the spirit remained. There beside her bed, like a shadow cast by nothing, and everything at once, it kept its quiet vigil. It made no sound, cast no cold, and yet its presence seemed to warm the very room it stood in. The peeling wallpaper seemed less lonely, the cracked window less broken. Even the dust that hung in the beams of morning light looked like something gentle, something golden. The village stirred slowly. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster call. Wood creaked. Water trickled down a gutter. But inside the little house, time still moved to its own rhythm, calm, slow, dreamlike. Eera slept for hours. When her eyes opened again, the sun had begun to pour into the room in soft amber hues. She blinked once, slowly, then again. And without moving, she looked toward the corner. Empty. The shadow was gone. For a moment, something inside her faltered, like waking from a dream so vivid, you swear it must have been real. She sat up quickly, her heart stumbling in her chest. The air in the room felt different, lighter, warmer, but emptier too. Her fingers clenched the blanket. Her breath caught. Had she imagined it? Had her loneliness created a friend to soothe itself in the night? She stepped barefoot across the creaky floor, reaching the corner where it had stood. She pressed her hand to the wooden wall, half expecting the coolness to return, half hoping to feel something. Nothing. Just stillness. Her hand dropped slowly to her side. But before the ache could fully rise again, her eyes caught something strange, something on the floor near the corner. A trail of tiny, pale leaves. She knelt down, touching one gently. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight, not like any leaf she had ever seen. Translucent, delicate, and veined with faint silver patterns, like threads of moonlight trapped in glass. She picked one up and held it to the light. It glowed softly in her hand. Not imagined, not dreamed, real. The spirit had been real. Her breath escaped her in a shaky exhale, half laugh, half sob. And in that moment, standing in the morning light of her once lonely room, she felt something she hadn't known in years. Connection. Not to the villagers who feared her, not to the memories that eluded her, but to now, to this morning, to this strange and silent spirit who had come without a name or a voice and listened. She carried the leaf to her windowsill and placed it carefully beside a cracked ceramic bird. Then, without thinking, she began to hum. Low and quiet at first, barely a tune, a thread of sound long buried. She didn't know where it came from, perhaps from her mother's braid, perhaps from a dream, but it filled the room like sunlight warming forgotten stone. And the house, as if awakened from a long slumber, seemed to breathe again. That day, Eera moved differently. She tended the garden not out of routine, but with slow intention. gently touching each leaf, each petal, as though thanking them for still growing despite the silence. She swept the floor. She opened the windows. She watched the wind pass through the curtains like the brushing of invisible hands. And though she spoke no words aloud, her eyes said everything. Come back. I'll be here. That night, when the candle flickered low and the hush of sleep began to descend once more, she didn't whisper into the dark. She simply waited. Not out of desperation, but out of belief. And as the moon climbed higher into the velvet sky, as the stars blinked in their quiet rhythm, something stirred again. A shift in the room. A breath not her own. She didn't look toward the corner this time. She didn't need to, because she felt it. The same way she felt wind on her skin, or the pull of a tide too deep to see. He had returned. The spirit. Her spirit. This time she smiled. It was small, barely there. The kind of smile born not from happiness, but from something more sacred, recognition. She pulled the quilt up to her chin and turned to face the corner, even though she still saw nothing. She didn't need to. The presence filled the space beside her like a quiet promise, like moonlight slipping across her skin. The candle burned low, casting a final golden flicker across the walls before surrendering to the darkness. Eera closed her eyes, and in the hush that followed there was no fear, no ache, no longing, just a steady, quiet peace. The spirit watched, silent, still, and in that shared quiet, neither broken nor healed, they simply existed, together. One girl, one wish, one friend. Night returned as it always did, slipping quietly over the rooftops of the village, painting the world in shades of indigo and ash. The stars blinked into view, slow and solemn. And above the crooked chimney of the quiet house on the hill, the moon climbed higher, round and watchful. Inside, Eera sat cross-legged on her bed, her hands resting in her lap, her eyes drawn once more to the same shadowed corner. There was no movement, no whisper, only stillness. And yet, the room felt different again. The air, though cool, was not empty. The quiet, though deep, didn't feel vacant. Something unseen lingered, just beyond the veil of light, just out of focus. She tilted her head slightly, listening not with her ears, but with something deeper, a sense, perhaps, that she had buried long ago, the kind that once let her feel the heartbeat of the earth when she lay in the tall summer grass. That ancient, intuitive knowing. Then, as the last flame of her bedside candle flickered and faded, it happened. A shimmer. Barely a distortion. Like the air thickening just before a summer storm. From the corner of her eye, something materialized, not with drama, not with weight, but with the gentleness of a thought entering the mind. A figure, tall, faceless, cloaked in silence, no face. The same legend whispered by frightened villagers around crackling fires. The spirit that wandered the edges of the world, drawn to grief, drawn to those who had been forgotten. A ghost with no voice, no identity, and no intent that anyone could name. But Eera did not scream. She did not run. She did not hide. She only stared. Not with fear, but with the kind of wonder that holds its breath. The figure did not move toward her. It made no gesture, no noise. It simply stood, shrouded in a vague, translucent shimmer, as if wrapped in a thin veil of mist. Moonlight spilled through the window and passed through it like fog. The spirit absorbed no light and cast no shadow. It was there, and it wasn't. Eera's fingers tightened slightly around the blanket in her lap. Her breathing grew shallower, but not from panic. She blinked once, then again, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks. Unsure if the ache of loneliness had conjured something from the recesses of need. But it remained. Just standing. Just watching. She opened her mouth, though she wasn't sure what she would say. A question? A plea? A welcome? No words came. Just the soft hush of breath and the low thrum of her own heartbeat, until the spirit did not respond, did not shift, did not even ripple. But it stayed. And there, in that suspended moment, something unspoken passed between them. A message without language. A presence without explanation. For a long time, they simply existed in the same room. Two beings from very different places, tied together by something neither of them could name. The wind outside stirred the trees. Their leaves whispered against the glass, as if trying to speak the words Eera could not. The rest of the house remained quiet, unmoving, respectful. Then, ever so slowly, the figure began to drift. Not with footsteps, not with any visible effort. Just moved. Not toward the door, not toward the window, but toward her. Eera didn't shrink back. Her breath caught for a moment, a thread of unease tightening in her chest. But still she stayed. Her eyes never left the faceless mask that hung where a face should be, blank and expressionless, yet strangely familiar. The figure stopped just short of the bed. Then, with the most delicate grace, it lowered itself beside her, not quite touching the quilt, not quite seated on the floor. It hovered just above, as if even gravity treated it with reverence. No Face simply sat beside her, saying nothing, doing nothing, just there. Eera's heartbeat slowed. Her shoulders softened. The tightness behind her eyes eased, though she didn't understand why. She turned toward the window again, as if to collect her thoughts, her emotions, her disbelief. The stars still shone. The moon still watched. And in her room, a room once too big for one lonely girl, there was now someone else. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know what would happen next. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Just unsure. And somehow, that was enough. For a while, nothing more happened. No movement. No sound. Only the quiet rhythm of two presences sharing the same fragile moment. Eera sat still, the blanket pulled loosely around her legs. Her fingers curled in the fabric, warm now from her hands, but damp at the edges. She could feel her own pulse, soft and steady, as if her heart were trying to understand something before her mind could. The spirit beside her didn't look at her. Not that it could, not in any way she recognized. It had no eyes, no expression, just a blank, pale face where emotion should have lived. But somehow its stillness wasn't empty. It felt intentional, present, like it was choosing to stay. And that, perhaps, was the strangest part of all. No one had ever chosen to stay. Not since that night. Not since the world went silent around her. She glanced sideways, just briefly, toward where it floated. There were no details to memorize, no color to catch her eye. The figure remained undefined, like a half-remembered dream. Yet it gave off a gentle stillness, like the hush between falling snowflakes, or the final notes of a lullaby. And in that stillness, questions began to form inside her, quietly, cautiously, like seedlings pushing through frost. Why are you here? What are you? Do you understand me? Can you leave? Will you? But Eera didn't ask, not out loud. The silence felt too sacred, too delicate to break. So instead, she simply breathed. Outside, clouds had gathered, trailing across the moon like wisps of smoke. Shadows danced lightly on the floorboards, shifting as the light dimmed and deepened. The spirit didn't react. It seemed untouched by time, unaffected by the pull of night or the murmur of wind. Yet it waited, not impatiently, not expectantly, just waited, as if the very act of being beside her was its only task. Eera's body began to ease into the quiet. The weight that always sat on her chest, unseen, unspoken, began to shift. Not vanish, not disappear, but change, soften. As though this silent presence knew the language of grief, not through words, but through being. And maybe that was enough. She sat a little straighter. Then, barely audible, she whispered into the room, not even sure she wanted it to hear. Everyone always says I should forget. The spirit didn't respond. But somehow, the air seemed to acknowledge the words, like the walls had heard, like the night itself leaned in. I try, she continued. But it doesn't go away. It just waits inside me. Another pause. They think I'm broken. The silence settled again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It held her like a gentle hand on the shoulder. She had never said those words aloud, not even to herself. And now that they'd been spoken, she didn't want to take them back. She looked once more at the faceless spirit. You don't think that, do you? Still nothing. But again it stayed. And for Eera, that was an answer. She lay back on the bed slowly, the mattress creaking beneath her. The spirit remained seated at her side, unmoving. Her eyes stayed open, tracing the beams of moonlight across the ceiling. She didn't know what would happen come morning, whether the spirit would fade again like mist in the sun. But somehow it didn't matter, because right now, in this quiet hour between sleep and sorrow, she wasn't alone, and that meant something. Maybe everything. She didn't sleep right away, not like the night before when exhaustion had carried her gently into the dark. Tonight she stayed awake with eyes half closed, drifting between thought and quiet watching. The silence felt deeper now, but not empty. It was full of presence, like the hush inside a cathedral, or the stillness before the tide returns. No face sat motionless at her side, not looming, not imposing, just there, as though the very concept of companionship had taken form and chosen a shape both ghostly and gentle. Eera shifted slightly beneath her quilt, her hand brushing against the edge of the mattress closest to him. For a moment, she thought of reaching out, to see if it was real, if it was touchable. But something held her back, not fear, not doubt, but reverence. Some things, she realized, are better left unexplained. They are simply felt. So instead she let her hand rest on the quilt, only inches away, and that closeness was enough. She watched the window again as the moon continued its slow passage across the sky. Outside, the trees had begun to sway gently as if moved by an unseen breath. Their silhouettes danced against the curtains in slow, sweeping patterns, like shadows of thoughts she hadn't yet formed. Her voice was barely more than a breath when she spoke again. I thought spirits were supposed to be cold. And yet she didn't feel cold. Not anymore. The chill that had always lived beneath her skin, the one that never left, no matter how many layers she wore, no matter how many candles she lit, had softened. The room still carried its evening hush, but the cold was gone. In its place, a strange warmth. Not heat, not fire, but something steady, like standing in sunlight behind a closed window. She turned her head to look at him. This figure who should have frightened her. This thing from stories meant to warn children and keep them obedient. But there was nothing fearful in his presence. Nothing cruel, just mystery and patience. She didn't know what he wanted, if he even wanted anything. That was the strangest part. Everyone in her life had wanted something from her, about her, because of her. Answers, explanations, behavior. But this being asked for nothing. He didn't even speak. And perhaps that was why she felt safe. She blinked slowly, her body relaxing into the bed, her thoughts unwinding like ribbons in the wind. "I'm tired of being afraid," she murmured. "I think I was afraid for so long, I forgot how not to be." The silence deepened. Not heavy, not sad, just real. A moment passed, long and quiet. Then Eera did something she hadn't done in years. She let her eyes close, not because she wanted to hide, but because she trusted that when she opened them again, something would still be there. Maybe not an answer, maybe not a cure, but someone, a thread connecting her to the world again, however fragile. She turned slightly in bed, her body curling toward the seated figure. Her hand slipped just over the edge of the quilt again, fingers half open, resting on the mattress between them. She didn't think he'd respond. She didn't expect him to. But even so, he moved. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a shift. His presence, once still, leaned the slightest bit closer. And though nothing touched her, not even the air between them, she felt it. That impossibly soft, unseen moment where loneliness receded, just a little, and was replaced with something else. Something that didn't yet have a name. The minutes passed, slow and syrupy, as if time itself were reluctant to interrupt what had begun. And still, he stayed. Eera's breath was calm now, the rise and fall of her chest in rhythm with the quiet heartbeat of the room. The spirit hadn't spoken, of course he hadn't. But something in his stillness made her feel as though she'd been heard, as though each unspoken word from her heart had settled softly between them, like snowflakes that didn't melt, only stayed and shimmered. No one had ever listened like that before. Not with ears, with presence. Outside, the clouds parted again, and moonlight returned, falling gently across the floor like a sheet of silver silk. The light touched the edge of the spirit's pale mask, casting a faint reflection on the wooden boards below. Eera watched it. Watched the way his form absorbed the light without claiming it. He was not made of this world. That much she knew. But then again, neither was her grief. Maybe that's why he had come. The villagers had feared this spirit, told tales of him, drifting through forests, appearing in the dreams of those who were lost. They said he brought strange visions. They said he mirrored your soul, that if you were unkind, he became monstrous. But if your heart was pure, he stayed gentle, like water taking the shape of your pain. And Eera had always wondered, was she pure? Was she broken? Was she cursed? Maybe she was all three. Maybe that's why he hadn't left. She studied him again in the moonlight. The blank ivory face, the soft curve of his shadow, no lines, no expression, and yet it wasn't empty. Somehow she saw kindness in that stillness. Somehow the silence between them spoke. It said, "You don't need to explain yourself to me." And in that quiet, something long locked away began to shift inside her. Not break, not shatter, but shift. Like an old door creaking open, just enough to let light into a room no one had dared enter in years. She turned back toward the ceiling, her voice barely a murmur. "They used to say you only come for the sad ones," she said, not accusing, just curious. Is that true? No response, of course. But again, that sense, that feeling, not denial, not affirmation, just understanding. She smiled just a little. She hadn't meant to. It caught her off guard, like sunlight slipping past curtains she thought were closed. "I guess that makes sense," she whispered. "I've been sad for a long time." A small sigh escaped her lips, not heavy, not bitter, more like release, a softness she hadn't known she was capable of anymore. She blinked slowly. Then in a voice, quieter than breath, "Thank you for coming." She didn't expect a response, and none came. But a faint shimmer passed through the air, barely visible, like heat rising from stone after sundown. It rippled once, then faded. And somehow she knew he had heard her. That was enough. The house, long used to emptiness, held the moment like a secret. Nothing more happened. No visions, no dreams with wings or songs from far-off stars. Just silence. Deep, gentle, shared. And for Eera, that silence was the most magical thing of all. Because it was no longer hers alone. That night stretched on without interruption. The wind outside grew softer, as if respecting what now rested within these old walls. Even the floorboards, known for their night creaks and restless sighs, remained still beneath the hush. Time itself bowed its head, letting the world exhale. And still, he sat, not moving, not vanishing, just being. Eera didn't sleep immediately, but she no longer lay stiff with anxiety or curled with invisible dread. Her body softened, no longer braced against unseen terrors. The air, once thick with the memory of absence, now carried a trace of quiet presence. She stared at the ceiling, at the corners of shadow where light couldn't reach. And somewhere in the space between midnight and dawn, a quiet knowing settled in her chest. She was no longer alone. She didn't know how long he would stay, whether he was bound to her sorrow or her wish or something older still. But tonight he had chosen to sit by her side, saying nothing, demanding nothing. A spirit made of silence, becoming the one thing she had forgotten how to believe in: companionship. That word ached in her heart like a forgotten lullaby. Her fingers shifted beneath the quilt, brushing the mattress again. No touch, no pressure. But the nearness of him made the space warmer than it had ever been, not with heat, but with presence, with being seen. The legends had always painted No-Face as a warning, a mirror of human hearts. But lying there beside him, Eera saw no warning, no threat, only stillness, only listening, only quiet, unwavering company. The kind no story had ever promised her before. She closed her eyes, not to escape, but to rest. And still, he sat. As the sky began its slow fade from black to a smoky violet, Eera drifted near sleep. That half-conscious space where dreams start to form, not wild or bright, but soft and muted, like fog rolling through trees. A flicker passed through her thoughts of her parents, once bright stars in her memory, their laughter, their warmth, her mother brushing snow from her hair, her father's hands calloused and gentle, images that had become jagged, scattered things, now returning slowly, reshaped by time and longing. She didn't cry, not yet, but she felt, and that alone was more than she'd managed in what felt like lifetimes, each breath met by silence. And still he sat. No-Face, the silent spirit from stories meant to frighten, now quiet company for a girl long forgotten by her village, her world, and at times herself. She didn't know what would come next, what tomorrow would bring, whether this presence would remain by her side or vanish with the light. But in this moment, this sliver of night balanced on the edge of dawn, Eera was not afraid. She was not sure, but she was not afraid. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for someone to leave. She was simply existing. And someone chose to stay. The days that followed were quiet. Not in the way they used to be, stiff with sorrow, hollow with ache, but in a softer way, like the hush of early morning woods, when the trees are still deciding whether to stretch or slumber just a little longer. That kind of quiet. Eera moved through her little world with the same routines as always. She lit the hearth. She fetched water. She tended to the creaky wooden steps. But now her steps no longer echoed quite so far. The silence no longer swallowed her whole. It listened, 'cause he was still there. No Face hadn't spoken, hadn't made a sound. But he remained. Wherever she went, beneath the willow tree, beside the old broken swing, by the rain-slicked cobblestones behind the cottage, he followed, never too close, never too far. Just present. At first she said nothing. She didn't know how. Words had rusted inside her, gone unused for so long. Her voice was a forgotten drawer she was afraid to open, afraid it might be empty or worse, full of things that hurt. But then one morning the rain came, a gentle drizzle. Not enough to soak, just enough to kiss the earth and draw out the scent of moss and old roots. Eera stood at the edge of the woods, listening to the drops fall like tiny piano notes against the leaves. The air smelled of wet bark and memory. She didn't plan to speak. She just did. "It smells like the day we left the city," she said quietly, her words nearly lost in the patter of the rain. No Face stood a few paces behind her, silent as ever, motionless, listening. "I was 5, she added, as if that explained something. The spirit didn't move. But he didn't leave either. So she went on. "The trains were loud. I didn't like them. But my father, he held my hand the whole way. Told me we were going someplace with real stars. Said they would look after us." She looked up at the sky, the rain making soft paths down her cheeks like teardrops too gentle to sting. "I didn't know he meant a place like this. I thought we'd be happier." Her voice broke a little on that word. Happier. A hope that had been packed in her suitcase long ago, buried beneath too many seasons. She waited not for a reply, she never expected one, but for the feeling, a quiet response the spirit always gave. And it came. No Face tilted slightly. Barely enough to be called a nod, just enough to acknowledge. She breathed in. That small gesture was more than approval. It was permission. So she spoke again the next day, and the next. She told him about the birds that used to nest on the roof and how she used to count their feathers when they flew, about her mother's favorite lullaby, the one she couldn't remember the words to anymore, but still hummed from time to time. She spoke about the tree outside her window that looked like it was dancing in winter wind, about the bakery her father used to sneak pastries from, even when they had no money, because he said sweetness mattered just as much as survival. None of it was loud, none of it urgent, just fragments, pieces, dusty corners of a life she hadn't dared enter for years. And each time, No Face listened. Always still, always silent, but listening. She never asked him to speak. Somehow she knew his silence was not emptiness, but reverence. Like a cathedral with no altar, a forest with no trail. Sacred because it asked for nothing in return. Her voice, once scratchy from disuse, grew softer, steadier, not polished. Never that, but real, honest. The kind of voice that had known pain but chose not to let it define the ending. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch with her knees hugged to her chest and the scent of rain still lingering in the planks, she realized something strange. She no longer minded the quiet, because it wasn't silence anymore. It was a conversation. With the world, with memory, with someone who stayed. She began to talk more. Not every moment, not even every day. But enough that the silences between no longer felt like walls. There were just pauses, like commas in a sentence too long to speak all at once. Sometimes she'd talk while folding laundry. Sometimes with her hands buried in garden soil, dirt under her fingernails and sunlight tangled in her hair. Sometimes her words spilled out as she watched the fire crackle. Little stories, unfinished thoughts, questions no one had ever answered for her. She didn't know if he understood, but she hoped, And somehow, that was enough. Because every time she spoke, he remained. Not out of duty, not out of pity, but as if, in the quiet space between her words, he found something too. Evenings came earlier now. Summer had begun to wane, pulling golden light down over the hills like a worn blanket. The forest grew quieter, more thoughtful. One evening, she brought him to the stream that wound behind her cottage, the same one her parents used to lead her to when the world felt heavy. She hadn't visited in years. The rocks were still smooth and damp with moss, the water cool and silver as ever. She sat by the edge and rested her arms on her knees. He used to sing to the water, she said after a while. My father said if you sang kindly enough, it would sing back. She let out a soft laugh, more breath than sound. I think I believed him, for too long. The spirit stood beside her, his faceless mask, catching only fragments of the twilight. I sang after they disappeared, she confessed. Every night, for weeks, until I realized the stream never answered. A silence settled then, one thick with memory, not absence. Eera dipped her fingers into the water. The ripples spread outward, shivering under the fading sky. But maybe that wasn't the point, she whispered. The spirit turned slightly, just slightly. Maybe I wasn't singing for the stream. The wind moved gently through the trees, shifting their branches like slow dancers. A single leaf spiraled down and landed near her feet. She smiled faintly. That night, she didn't speak at all. She didn't need to, because by then she had learned something sacred. Some words are only seeds. You plant them, not to be heard, but to grow. And in No-Face's silence, her words had grown roots. He had never replied, never nodded, never gestured more than the softest tilt of his head. But he had listened, truly listened. And in that, Eera found what no conversation had ever given her before, acknowledgement. The kind that doesn't try to fix, to solve, or to teach, just to be there, to witness. She found herself humming again, softly, not her mother's lullaby. She still couldn't remember the tune, but something new, a melody made from the shape of her own voice, like a thread weaving itself into the dusk. And still, he listened. That fragile, invisible bond between them, woven not from words, but from presence, tightened with each passing dusk. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real as the whisper of pine needles, as real as the hush of rain. And one afternoon, when her voice broke mid-sentence, snagged on a memory she hadn't meant to speak aloud, she didn't retreat, didn't run. She let the silence fill the space, let the ache rest beside her like an old friend. And No-Face remained still. He didn't move closer, didn't offer comfort in any visible way, but his presence didn't waver, not once. And in that unwavering stillness, Eera found her own strength reflected back at her. Not because someone caught her, but because someone chose to stay while she steadied herself. Eera began leaving things out for him. Not gifts, exactly. Just small gestures, like someone setting a place at the table for someone who might be hungry. A folded blanket beside the porch step. A smooth stone she'd found shaped like a heart. A sprig of lavender tucked carefully into a cup. She never saw him touch them, but she always noticed when they disappeared. Once she drew something in the dirt. A quick sketch with a fingertip. A moon with sleepy eyes. A single cloud cradling it like a pillow. When she came back the next day, the drawing was still there, but something had changed. A second cloud had been added, just below hers. She didn't ask if it was him. She didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with soft echoes, shared breaths, quiet understandings that needed no explanation. And that's when she realized something had shifted. Not just between them, but within her. She wanted to talk. not to fill the silence, not to chase away the dark, but because her voice mattered, even if no one answered, even if no one could. It was dusk again, her favorite time, when the sky seemed unsure of what it wanted to be, blue or purple or just quietly gold. The air hummed with that in-between feeling, like the world was holding its breath. Eera sat on the old wooden swing that had once been hers long ago. The ropes had frayed, but still held strong, like so many things in her life. She swayed gently, toes brushing the ground. Her voice was soft. "I used to think no one could hear me," she said, like I was shouting into a void, too big for sound. The spirit stood nearby, unmoving. "But now, I think maybe I wasn't supposed to be heard the way I thought. Maybe some people don't echo. They hold." She tilted her head, looking at him. Not afraid, not puzzled anymore, just quiet. "You hold my words." The wind rustled the trees in reply. And in that moment, something inside her cracked. Not a painful break, but a thaw, like frost giving way to spring. She remembered her mother's hands, warm and worn, always smelling of flower and rosemary. She remembered the way her father whistled when he didn't know she was listening. She remembered her brother's laughter, wild and full of sparks. All these memories, once buried like bones, now floated gently to the surface, not to hurt her, not to haunt her, but to remind her that she had loved, that she had been loved. And even now, after all this time, that love hadn't vanished. It had just changed shape. It was in the way she tucked the blanket over the porch rail. It was in the way she hummed to the trees. It was in the way she let herself be heard, even by someone who never spoke. The next morning, she didn't wait to be asked. She simply began telling him a story, not one from her past, but one she imagined. A tale about a fox who followed moonlight through the woods in search of a voice he had lost. She described the trees, the silver paths, the way the moon looked like it was smiling down at him. And even though the story had no ending yet, she promised him it would. He tilted his head again as if to say, "I'm listening." Eera smiled. A real smile. The kind of smile that comes not when pain vanishes, but when it is finally understood. She no longer needed answers. She just needed presence. And he gave her that with every still breath, every silent moment, every steady watch through wind and storm. The days folded into each other, gentle and quiet. Eera still had moments when silence clawed back in, old habits, shadows that crept through the seams of her thoughts. But now she didn't run from them. She let them sit beside her. And so did he. The spirit, still faceless, remained constant. Not a ghost in the way legends warned, not a phantom who haunted, but a stillness that listened, even when she had nothing left to say. One evening, as dusk pooled like watercolor over the horizon, she picked up a pencil for the first time in years. Her fingers trembled. Her heart didn't. She sat by the open window, knees to her chest, and began to draw, not with a purpose, not to finish, but to feel. A curve here, a shadow there, a flicker of shape that resembled him, not in form, but in feeling. Soft edges, presence without weight, the idea of someone who simply stayed. He stood behind her, unmoving, as if afraid to disturb the moment. She looked over her shoulder and smiled, not shyly, not nervously, just openly, like she wanted him to see. And still he said nothing. But in that silence, she heard everything. "I see you. I hear you. I'm still here." That night, as they sat together under the stars, she did not speak. Not because she had run out of words, but because there were some moments too wide, too full for language. Instead, she leaned back against the porch rail, watching the constellations appear one by one, tiny lanterns dotting the velvet sky. He sat beside her, closer than before. She could almost feel him now, not skin or breath or heat, but something deeper. A presence that filled the spaces inside her she didn't know were empty. The breeze lifted the hair from her cheeks. Her heart beat slow, easy, safe. In the hush of night, something stirred in her that had long been buried. Not joy exactly, but his distant cousin. Peace. Not loud, not fast. Just present. Like him. And then, just before sleep reached her eyes, she whispered the simplest word she'd spoken in years. "I'm glad you came." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He only tilted his head gently, like always. And she knew. She knew. He was glad, too. The first illusion came quietly. It was dusk again. Always dusk, it seemed, when change whispered into her world. The kind of dusk where time folded softly in on itself, where birds stopped singing and the air turned to velvet. Eera had fallen asleep on the porch steps, head tilted back, eyelids fluttering in some half-dream. When she opened her eyes, the sky above her was moving. Not clouds, not stars, but stories. Light curled into shapes, delicate shimmering threads that danced in the air like silver ink on invisible parchment. They wove patterns, and those patterns became visions. She blinked, sat up, and watched. There, above her, floated a field of flowers, her field, the one from years ago, the one behind the old mill where her mother once braided daisies into her hair and her brother pretended to be a knight, wielding a stick as if it were a blade forged in fire. The illusion shimmered in silence, but she felt the sounds it held, the rustle of grass, the distant hum of bees, the thrum of running feet. It was not memory, not quite, but not fantasy either. It was something else, something between worlds. A gift wrapped in light. No face stood near the edge of the vision, not inside it, not commanding it, just allowing it, like a door that had quietly been opened. Eera did not speak. She only stood, heart pounding, not in fear, but in stunned awe. She stepped closer. The flowers tilted gently in her direction. The breeze within the illusion stirred her hair. For a moment, she forgot the weight in her chest, forgot the silence that once sealed her throat shut, forgot the ache of being the only one left. This beauty was not a replacement for what she lost. It was remembrance made luminous. Another illusion bloomed beside the first. This one was the sea. Not just any sea, but the cove where her father taught her to skip stones. The water glowed with soft blues and greens, not like water at all, but like living glass. She watched a tiny version of herself toss a stone into the waves. It bounced once, twice, sank. Then the little figure laughed. The illusion faded like fog at dawn. Eera touched her own cheek, surprised to find it wet. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. For the first time in so long, she remembered joy without choking on it. More illusions came. Not all at once, never too much. Just one at a time. Gentle, patient, like a friend who knows when to speak and when to simply sit beside you in the dark. One morning, as the mist curled low around her home, she stepped outside and found butterflies made of starlight drifting through the air. They didn't belong to any memory she could place. Maybe they weren't memories at all. Maybe they were dreams. Hers or his, or both. One landed on her hand. It pulsed softly, warm like breath, then vanished. She didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. She only closed her fingers around the space where it had been, and smiled. The following evening, Eera lit a candle and waited, not out of expectation, but of quiet hope. She sat cross-legged by the window, wrapped in her patchwork blanket. eyes scanning the shadows that now felt less like threats and more like invitations. She didn't wait long. From the edge of the tree line, where moonlight pooled like milk on the earth, the spirit appeared again. No face, silent as always, his presence less startling now. Familiar, like the hush that settles over a lake just before dawn. He raised his hand, slowly, delicately, and with that single motion, the air above them began to bend. And then the sky cracked open into color. 100 floating lanterns drifted into view, not from wires or rooftops, but from nothing. Glowing orbs like tiny suns, orange and gold, rose weightlessly above her cottage and swirled into the twilight. Each lantern held a flicker of something inside, shapes Eera couldn't quite name. Moments, emotions, wishes. She reached out. One drifted close enough to touch. When her fingertip brushed its edge, the world changed again. Suddenly, she stood inside a memory she hadn't thought of in years, a soft blanket, the smell of cinnamon, her mother humming as she stirred something on the stove, rain tapping gently on the windows. Not a word was spoken, not a face was shown. But she knew where she was, and her chest ached, not from sorrow this time, but from the beauty of it, the nearness. The illusion faded, and she gasped, not in panic, but in wonder, as if she'd breached the surface of a deep, forgotten sea and drawn her first full breath in years. She looked toward the spirit. No face simply watched. Not proud, not pleased, just present. He had shown her what was buried, not to break her, not to make her ache, but to let her see that beauty still lived there, that not every memory had to hurt. More nights passed. More illusions came. Some playful. A paper bird made of wind and light that swooped through her room while she chased it, giggling into the corners. A garden of glowing reeds that swayed to music only her heart could hear. Other illusions were bittersweet. A pair of hands tying a ribbon around her wrist, a fire crackling while her family sang lullabies. She had long stopped humming. These didn't bring her pain anymore. They brought her tears, yes, but soft ones. Not like the heavy ones that used to fall in silence. These were release. Like snow melting after a long, bitter winter. Like spring returning to a forest that had forgotten how to bloom. And all the while, no face remained, watching, listening, never interrupting the delicate unfolding of her spirit. On one particular night, she stood in the center of the room as a swirl of lights danced around her. Tiny scenes, like fragments of dreams, none she recognized, and yet all of them felt like hers. Colors shifted in slow spirals. Blues faded into golds, reds turned to lavender. The room pulsed like a heartbeat, and she stood in the middle of it. Not broken, not frightened. Open, alive. Then came a vision unlike the others. A young girl herself stood alone in the dark. Head bowed, shoulders trembling. The sky above her was empty. But then, from behind her, a light appeared. A faceless shape stepped forward and placed a hand over the child's heart. The sky bloomed with stars. Eera's breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, hand trembling, and reached toward the illusion, toward the echo of herself. Her fingers passed through the light. It rippled, faded, and left behind a warmth in her chest, so real, so tender, she thought it might break her all over again. But it didn't. Instead, it made space. Space for joy, for grief, for everything she thought she had lost forever. And as the last of the light melted into the night, a smile began to bloom on her face. Not imagined, not practiced. Real, tentative, soft, but wholly, beautifully hers. The next morning arrived slowly, as though the world itself was hesitant to disturb her newfound stillness. A light mist clung to the treetops. The forest, often so gray and distant, now seemed to shimmer ever so faintly, like it remembered something too. It was the same forest she had known her whole life. Gnarled trunks, tangled roots, mossy stone paths. But this morning, it felt like it was breathing with her. Eera stepped outside barefoot. The cold earth greeted her, not with a jolt, but a soft grounding. Blades of grass clung to her skin. A small breeze curled around her like an old friend returning. She looked up, not to search for illusions, but to absorb the quiet miracle of an ordinary day. Everything felt different now, or perhaps she did. Her cottage, which once stood like a forgotten monument to sorrow, felt warmer. Changed not in its walls, but in how her heart now received it. Its windows didn't glare with emptiness anymore. They blinked, soft and tired, like the eyes of something beginning to dream again. The spirit stood at the edge of the clearing, half wrapped in mist and early morning light. No-Face said nothing, as always. And yet his presence, once alien, was now familiar, a silence that didn't demand anything, only shared the space, a quiet that honored her pain without trying to fix it. That evening, just as twilight pooled like ink across the forest floor, another illusion arrived. This one was simple. A feather. It drifted downward out of the sky, turning gently in the cool air. Eera watched its descent, mesmerized, not by what it was, but by what it felt like, as if the air itself was offering her a small, weightless truth. She reached out a hand, slow and reverent. The feather touched her skin and dissolved into light. A soft burst of gold and pale white circled her wrist, forming a ribbon of aurora-like shimmer that pulsed once, gently, then vanished. Her lips parted. She laughed. It was brief and unguarded, like something spilled before it could be contained. And when the laugh echoed off the trees, she didn't shrink from it. She didn't retreat into silence. She listened to it, as if hearing her own joy for the first time. The illusions became more curious after that, more playful. A swirl of butterflies made of moonlight circled her as she twirled in her nightdress. A tiny boat, stitched from shadows and starlight, floated across the pond outside her window. Each night, some new fragment of wonder emerged, not loud, not overwhelming, but precise and meaningful, as if woven just for her. Then came the illusion she never expected. It began not with color, but with stillness, and then vision, not memory, not fantasy, possibility. She saw herself, older, stronger, wiser, still quiet, still cloaked and calm, but different. In this vision, she walked through the same forest, but her shoulders were no longer hunched. Her steps had weight, confidence. Around her were other figures, some children laughing and tugging at her sleeves, some elders nodding softly as they passed. She couldn't make out faces, but she felt their warmth. And her future self, this imagined Eera, was smiling. Genuine, peaceful, alive. Tears welled in Eera's eyes, not from sadness, but from recognition. This vision wasn't just fantasy. It was an invitation. A whisper from the universe. There is still a road forward. Still a version of you yet to bloom. She stepped forward, hand outstretched, reaching toward that glimmer of hope. But the illusion vanished like fog under sunlight. She was left standing alone once more. But now the silence didn't sting. It pulsed with possibility. She turned to look at No-Face, who stood as he always did, expressionless, quiet, unmoving. And yet, she felt the warmth in the air, a kind of silent reassurance, the sense that he had given her more than magic. He had given her herself. She sat down on the forest floor, legs crossed, palms resting on the moss. She inhaled deeply, letting the scents of pine and damp leaves settle into her lungs. Then, in a voice no longer dusty or unsure, she whispered one word. Stay. It was the first thing she had asked of anyone in years. A single syllable. But it echoed like thunder through the chambers of her long-abandoned heart. No-Face gave no sign. He didn't nod. Didn't vanish. He simply sat down beside her, his stillness unbroken, his silence whole. And that was all she needed. They sat in silence together, girl and spirit, flesh and dream, grief and grace, until the stars rose above them. The forest slowed its breath. Even the wind, which had always whispered of loneliness, seemed now to hum a lullaby. Eera closed her eyes, not to shut out the world, but to feel it. Hope, joy, and peace. One hand rested on the earth, grounding her. The other reached gently upward, brushing through air that shimmered faintly, like the afterglow of all the illusions she had witnessed. She didn't need them anymore. The wonder was within her now. Her smile lingered, no longer hesitant, no longer shy. It was real. It belonged to her. And she wore it like light wears the morning, softly, steadily, with the promise of more. It had been many days since the illusions began. Days filled not just with quiet wonder, but with something heavier, stirrings beneath the surface of her heart. Eera could feel them, these ancient emotions. They had waited patiently, buried deep within her since the night everything changed. Now, like melting frost beneath spring's first sun, they were beginning to loosen. She didn't know what exactly was coming, only that it was time. That evening, the clouds hung low like old memories pressing down from above. The light had dimmed early, casting the forest and her cottage into a hush so complete that it felt sacred. The air wasn't cold, but she wrapped herself in her shawl anyway, as if to brace against something she could not name. No-Face stood by the old willow. He always did when something important was about to happen. And Eera, her steps slower than usual, walked to him, then past him, toward the garden's edge where the ground grew uneven and the wind felt sharper. It was the place her mother had loved to stand in the early morning, sipping tea. The place her father had once repaired a broken swing. The place her brother used to leave wildflowers he'd picked on the way home from town. It had been untouched for years, overgrown, forgotten. She stood there now among tangled weeds and moss-covered stones, and it hit her like a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. They were really gone. Not in the vague way she had allowed herself to believe, not swept away by mystery, not stolen into some fabled tragedy, but gone. Her mind had always refused to fill in the details. It was easier not to remember. Easier to let the silence of it fill the space so she wouldn't have to face the ache. But silence, she was learning, doesn't erase grief. It only buries it. And buried grief always finds a way to rise. Her knees buckled before she realized it. She knelt in the damp earth, her hands curling into the soil, her breath catching, then breaking, then unraveling entirely. The sobs came slowly at first, small, restrained things that trembled in her throat. But then, like a dam finally collapsing, the weight of years spilled out. She wept for the nights she'd cried herself to sleep and no one came. She wept for the birthdays spent in silence, staring at empty chairs. She wept for the blame she had placed upon herself without knowing, without reason. She wept for the part of her that had believed she didn't deserve joy or laughter, or even a simple hello. Her body folded inwards, as if trying to make itself small enough to disappear. The wind blew gently through her hair. A crow called somewhere in the trees. And still she wept. tears that had waited years to be shed, pain that had never found a voice, until now. Through it all, the spirit remained, not looming, not comforting in any expected way, but present, solid in the silence, a shadow that bore witness. His stillness did not offer answers, but it gave her space, and it told her wordlessly that this pain was not too much, that it could be carried, faced, survived. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had become soft, stretched, unmeasured, like the hush after a storm that doesn't quite know it's over. Eera remained on her knees, but her sobs had quieted now. They had burned through her like fire through dry leaves, furious, consuming, then gone. What remained was not emptiness, but stillness. A deep, aching stillness, like the silence after a bell stops ringing. Her cheeks were damp. Her fingertips were stained with soil and tears, and her chest felt lighter. Not healed, not whole, but freer. As if some great shadow she had carried for so long had finally stepped aside and allowed the light to reach her skin. Behind her, the soft crunch of moss hinted at movement. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She felt him there, the silent presence. A shape that brought neither comfort nor fear, only companionship. And in that still moment, she realized he had always known this was coming. The illusions, the silence, the listening. He hadn't arrived to distract her or to fix what was broken. He had come to stand with her while she remembered how to feel it all again. Not to escape the past, but to meet it, face to face. Her hand slowly opened, palm to the sky. She did not look at him, but she offered that small gesture. Fragile, trusting, uncertain. There was no sound, no fanfare, no shimmering illusion this time. Just the barest weight, a suggestion of warmth. His hand, faceless, formless, met hers, not gripping, not guiding, just resting. And that was enough. Eera closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she was no longer looking at the garden of grief. She was looking at the sky. It had broken open in the streaks of twilight. Deep violet, soft gold, pale indigo. Clouds moved like brushstrokes. The first star blinked quietly into view. She stood up slowly, her legs unsteady. There was mud on her dress, leaves in her hair, a tremble in her limbs. But there was also a sense of something shifting deep within her. A door had opened. And though it led into the darkest chamber of her soul, she had not entered it alone. She glanced at the willow tree, now swaying gently under the fading light. It looked different now. Not just a tree, a witness. A place that held memory with dignity, not dread. She turned back toward the house, the spirit following silently at her side. As they passed the broken swing, she paused, then sat. The wood creaked beneath her, vines brushing her ankles. She gripped the fraying ropes, lifted her feet, and let herself sway, slow, barely moving, but real. She hadn't sat on the swing since before everything vanished. And now here she was, older, quieter, not healed, not whole, but alive. She tilted her head toward the sky and whispered something the wind nearly carried away. Thank you. That night, the stars came out slowly, as if unsure whether they should interrupt the stillness below. The sky, painted in shades of deep blue and fading lilac, bore no judgment. It simply watched, quiet, vast, and understanding. Eera sat on the swing beneath the old willow, her legs tucked up slightly, the fraying ropes in her small hands. No face remained nearby, motionless as always, yet his presence was full. Not empty like the silence of before, but whole, purposeful, like a pause between gentle words. The swing creaked faintly with every breath of the wind. It was an old sound, familiar, a memory made audible. She didn't move much, just swayed with the rhythm of the evening. Her eyes gazed into the twilight sky, searching for something, not in the stars, but in herself. It was strange. This piece didn't feel triumphant. There was no victory music, no grand turning point. Just a girl, a ghost, and the weight of sorrow lighter than before. Grief, she realized, never truly left you. It didn't vanish when you cried enough tears or said the right words. It softened. It became part of you. Not a wound, but a shape. Not a chain, but a thread in the fabric of who you are. And maybe that was enough. She slid off the swing, her bare feet touching the soft grass. It was cool beneath her skin, damp with dew. The spirit drifted beside her as she walked, slowly back toward the house. The garden no longer looked like a graveyard of memories. The weeds were still there, the stones still cracked. But in her heart, it had changed. She had seen it now, not as the place where everything ended, but where it had been real, where laughter once echoed, where love once lived. She stepped into the house, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel so hollow. There was dust on the windowsill. A teacup still sat, long untouched, on the table by the fireplace. She didn't clean it. Didn't need to. Some things were meant to stay where they were. She lit a single candle and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. The soft flicker cast shadows across the room, some long, some strange, some eerily familiar. No face sat across from her. The flame reflected faintly on the smooth curve where his face might have been. Eera reached beneath the floorboard and pulled out an old wooden box. She hadn't opened it in years. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside were fragments, nothing more. A ribbon, a paper star, a sketch of her family drawn in her childish hand, a rusted key to a door that no longer existed. She held each one as if it were glass, remembering not just the objects, but the moments they carried. The way her mother used to hum when tying the ribbon in her hair. The night her brother taught her to fold the star. The way her father laughed, deep and warm. As she showed him her crooked drawing, she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't perfect. But it was real, and it stayed. Tears welled again, but they were different this time. They didn't come from pain. They came from memory, from love, from the knowing that those who leave us aren't gone entirely. They remain in the quiet, in the wind, in the places we once shared, and in the people we become. The candle flickered, then steadied. The spirit didn't move. Eera leaned back against the wall, her breath steady. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw them. Not like ghosts, but like echoes. Her mother brushing her hair beside the window. Her brother dancing across the room in mismatched socks. Her father lifting her into the air, laughing. She didn't reach for him. She just watched. Let them be what they were, bright and distant, and forever hers. She opened her eyes again. No face, still sat silently, a patient shadow in the firelight. And in a soft voice, barely audible, she whispered, "I remember now, and I think..." No face gave no sign. He didn't need to. His silence had always been more powerful than any words. He was never here to guide her past the pain. He was here so she wouldn't have to walk through it alone. Outside, the wind picked up. The trees whispered like a lullaby. And inside the little house at the edge of the forest, a girl sat with her sorrow. Not running, not hiding, just being. And sometimes that's where healing begins. She gathered the small items and placed them gently back into the box. Not to bury them again, but to keep them close with reverence, like stories waiting to be told. The flame of the candle danced once more, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Eera didn't dread tomorrow, because she had faced yesterday, and she had survived. There was no grand sign when the world began to feel different. No great trumpet of joy, no fireworks blooming in the sky. Only the gentle hush of morning light threading its way through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The quiet breath of wind through open windows. The soft rustle of a curtain lifting slightly as if sighing. Eera woke slowly, not startled, not afraid, just awake. The air smelled different, like sun-warmed wood and blooming clover. The room, though unchanged, held something new within it. A stillness that wasn't hollow anymore, a calm that didn't echo grief. It was as if the house itself had exhaled finally after years of holding its breath. She sat up and stretched, her small frame unfolding like a flower nudged gently by spring. The covers slipped from her shoulders, revealing a threadbare nightgown, soft with age and memory. No face was there, of course, silent always. By the window, watching as dawn unfolded itself across the hills. But she didn't startle at the sight of him anymore. He was simply part of the morning now, like the bird song or the light dust dancing in the air. She stepped down barefoot onto the creaking wooden floor, walked to the window and opened it wide. The wind kissed her cheeks, warm and alive. A bird fluttered from a nearby tree, its wings making a soft, percussive sound that seemed to say, "Today is new." She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun settle onto her skin. She didn't smile right away. She didn't force it. It came slowly, like the first bloom after a long winter. A curl of the lips, a softening of the brow, a breath drawn in, not just for survival, but for the joy of it. There it was, a smile, a real one. Not the kind she had worn for others long ago to hide her sorrow, but one born of quiet contentment, of peace, not yet perfect, but present. The smile stayed. She turned, glancing back toward the spirit by the window. He remained unmoving, featureless, but somehow knowing. Not proud, not sad, simply there, as he had always been. There was something comforting in that. Not everything had to change. Some things, some presences, could remain, and maybe that too was part of healing. Eera walked to the front porch. The door creaked open, not ominously now, but familiarly. She stepped into the garden that had once wilted under the weight of memory, and now, while it hadn't blossomed into perfection, it had changed. Weeds still curled around broken stones. Moss clung to the old wooden rail, but here and there color peeked through, tiny petals pushing from the dirt, leaves reaching for sunlight, a wildflower where none had grown before. She knelt beside one and touched it gently. His petals were fragile but firm. Like her. She stayed there for a while, just watching the breeze stir the leaves. She could hear the creek nearby, the one she used to fear, where echoes of the past once lingered. Now it sang softly, a lullaby she hadn't noticed before. The same song had always been there. She just hadn't been ready to listen. And when she finally stood again, she didn't feel the familiar heaviness return to her chest. She felt light, not empty, but light. She wandered further that morning, down paths she hadn't walked in years, past the rusted swing set, the fallen tree, the mossy stone wall. She touched them all, each landmark from her childhood, once sealed away behind pain, now opened like an old book, its pages weathered but intact. She paused beside a grove where the trees parted slightly and the sun streamed down like golden threads. There she sat, resting her back against the trunk of an old oak. A breeze tugged gently at her hair, and a bird landed nearby, curious but unafraid. And Eera laughed, softly. Not loudly, not wildly. Just a gentle, melodic laugh, like something being remembered. A melody she'd once known by heart and was now humming again for the first time. She laughed not because everything was perfect, but because it didn't have to be. Grief was still there, a quiet passenger she carried now with grace. But it no longer silenced her. Her heart was no longer frozen. It beat. It sang. And when she grew quiet again, that smile still lingered. The smile that stayed. As the sun climbed higher, the warmth on Eera's skin deepened. The golden light spilled over everything. The trees, the broken fence, the small stones that lined the old garden path. It gave the world a glow it hadn't worn in years, not in her eyes. Everything seemed to breathe now. Even the shadows looked softer. Eera stood slowly, brushing her hands on her skirt. Her footsteps were quieter now, lighter, no longer dragging. There was no destination in mind, only movement. And that was enough. Behind her, the silent spirit followed, not looming or hovering, but walking with the air of one who simply belonged. His presence had changed, too. Not in form, but in feeling. What had once seemed eerie now felt gentle, grounding, like the deep roots of a tree, unseen but strong beneath the earth. Together, they walked past the old river bend where years ago Eera had once stood, screaming silently into the water. The river no longer answered back with echoes of her pain. Today it simply shimmered, whispering like a friend. It carried no secrets, only the steady music of water gliding over stone. She paused to watch a dragonfly dance just above the surface. Its wings caught the sun in fleeting flashes like small fragments of a dream. She smiled at it, an unconscious, open expression. And in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore, not even in silence. It was strange how grief had once been everything. A wall around her, a weight pressing down. And now, it was just a thread in the fabric of her story, still there, but no longer unraveling her. She didn't need to speak to No-Face, and he didn't need to respond. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Later, as clouds began to gather in the afternoon sky, not storm clouds, but gentle, wandering ones, Eera returned home. The little house was just as she'd left it. Crooked steps, a door that stuck just slightly, windows that rattled when the wind passed through. But it no longer felt haunted. Inside, she made herself tea, something she hadn't done in years. She remembered how her mother used to add a spoon of honey. She did the same now, and the taste was both sweet and sorrowful. But the sorrow didn't break her. It was simply a note in the cup, part of the flavor, not the whole. She sat with the cup between her palms, warm against her skin, and looked toward the window. No-Face stood nearby, still and calm. The tea warmed her throat, but more than that, it grounded her. She belonged to this moment, to the air in the room, to the quiet that wasn't loneliness anymore, to herself. Later that night, after the sun had set and the stars began to press their light gently into the darkened sky, Eera returned to her bed. She laid down without dread. The ceiling above her no longer felt like a cave of ghosts, but a canvas of peace. The shadows in the corners of the room did not frighten her. The night did not whisper terrors. Everything had softened. She reached toward the window one last time before sleep took her, drawing the curtain slightly to the side. Moonlight spilled through, brushing her face with its silver touch. No-Face was still there, just beyond the window's edge, watching, not waiting, simply witnessing. Eera smiled, not a smile for anyone else, not even for him, but for herself, for the girl who had survived, for the girl who had faced the dark, wept her storms, and found the sun again. Her eyes fluttered shut, and in the stillness that followed, nothing grand occurred. Only peace, only breath, only rest. The spirit stayed beside her, unmoving, bathed in moonlight. The house, once filled with grief, now held a heartbeat again. And Eera? She slept with a smile that would stay. The days grew longer, and the air warmer. Time softened around Eera like the fog that rolled in gently from the sea, wrapping her in stillness rather than swallowing her whole. Each morning she opened her windows and let in the light. Some mornings, she would sit on the front step with a warm cup of tea, hands curled around the mug. The cup had once belonged to her mother, chipped slightly, faded along the rim. But in her hands now it was whole again. She sipped slowly, watching the dew evaporate from the wild grass. There was no rush. No face would be there too. Always nearby, never looming. He didn't intrude. He didn't seek attention. But she knew he was watching, listening, being. Sometimes, without words, she would gesture for him to sit beside her. He would glide across the garden, a shadow made of wind and ancient presence, and settle beside her. There was never any sound, no footstep, no whisper, but somehow she felt him completely. Together they watched the world move. Birds took flight. Bees floated lazily through blossoms. Leaves turned toward the sun. Life did not wait for her to heal. It moved onward. But now, Eera moved with it. There were still difficult nights. Nights when memory knocked too loudly. When her mother's voice echoed in her dreams. When she woke in the dark with tears she didn't remember shedding. But the difference was this. She no longer felt lost in those moments. She had no face. The moon. Her own voice. She had grown strong enough to cry without breaking. To remember without drowning. Once, after a particularly restless evening, she went out into the yard barefoot. The earth was cool and damp with midnight dew. The stars shimmered above like distant memories, twinkling with unreachable warmth. She didn't speak. She just walked. Each step in the grass, a quiet act of defiance against the shadow of sorrow. Behind her, she sensed movement. The soft stir of air like wind brushing through fog. No face. He followed, not too near, not too far. She walked the orchard path, trailing her fingertips along the low-hanging branches. She remembered helping her father plant the saplings. She had been 6, her boots too big, her laugh still untouched by grief. As she passed each tree, she whispered a name. One for her father, one for her mother, one for her brother. And when she reached the last tree, the one that never bore fruit, she stopped, rested her hand against the trunk. "I still miss you," she said softly. The leaves above rustled, though there was no wind. Behind her, the spirit said nothing, but the world felt full. Healing didn't come like a wave crashing in. It came like a tide, soft, patient, returning again and again. There were days Eera forgot the weight she once carried. She would hum as she tidied the house. She'd gather herbs in a woven basket and brew teas not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. She would string wildflowers together and hang them above the door. The past had carved deep into her, but now it had given her roots. She was growing again. One spring morning, something unexpected happened. A child from the village wandered too far, chasing a blue butterfly beyond the edge of the woods. She stumbled into Eera's garden, wide-eyed and panting, face flushed from running. Eera, startled at first, approached slowly. The girl didn't run. Instead, she tilted her head and looked at Eera the way one might look at a story told by firelight, cautious, curious, drawn in. "You're the ghost girl," the child whispered. Eera blinked. That old name. She knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. "No," she said gently, brushing a loose strand of hair from the child's forehead. "Not anymore." The girl smiled. Then, without fear, she took Eera's hand. After that, others came too. Not in crowds, not with fanfare, but in quiet ways. A woman from the village left a basket of apples on her porch. An old man passed by and offered a tip of his hat. Children peeked around the edges of the trees, giggling, not in cruelty, but in wonder. Eera welcomed none of it with expectation, but she accepted it all with grace. Her world had opened. And yet, through it all, the spirit remained by her side, unchanged, unaging, ever still. On the final day of our story, Eera awoke before dawn. The sky was soft lavender, with hints of gold pressing at the horizon. She dressed in a simple linen dress and walked to the same hill where everything had begun. The air smelled of earth and blossoms. Birds stirred in the branches. She sat beneath the same crooked tree, closed her eyes. Beside her, No Face emerged from the morning mist. He took his usual place, close but never touching. They sat in silence. As the sun rose, spilling light across the land like liquid gold, Eera spoke. Not to him, not to anyone, but simply into the world. "I'm still here." A pause. "And I'm okay." She smiled. Not because everything had been fixed, not because the past had vanished, but because something within her had changed. She had survived. She had healed. And now she lived. Her smile was soft. Her eyes glistened, not from tears, but from light. And for the first time in many years, she let herself rest fully, her head tilting back, hair catching in the wind. No Face did not move. He watched, silent, still. Not a protector anymore, but a witness to her story, to her strength, to her becoming. And so, under the vast sky, painted with soft colors and drifting clouds, Eera closed her eyes. The breeze kissed her cheeks. The earth held her gently. And beside her, the silent spirit faded ever so slightly into the morning light, not leaving but becoming part of everything. And the final image we're left with, simple, perfect still, is this: a girl no longer haunted, a smile no longer hesitant, a spirit no longer feared, and peace that at last stayed forever. Years passed, and the echoes of silence that once ruled Eera's world became something distant, almost gentle, like the hush that falls before dawn. Her cottage remained and nestled at the edge of the forest, but time had touched it with renewal. The once cracked shutters now opened wide to welcome morning light. The candle that once flickered beside her in solitude now stood tall in its holder, lit only on quiet nights of reflection, not necessity. Where silence had once stifled her, it now hummed in harmony with her breath. Eera had grown, not just older, but fuller. Her hair, once tangled and dim, now flowed in soft waves the color of midnight warmed by starlight. Her hands, once clenched around memories and fear, had learned to plant, to sketch, to heal. Her eyes still held that ocean-deep quiet, but they no longer drifted in sorrow. Now, they sparkled with intention and peace. She had stayed in the village she once felt so alien in. Not out of fear of the unknown, but out of love for what had changed. For what she had changed. The people who once turned their faces away from her now nodded in passing. Some offered warm bread on snowy mornings. Others came to her for herbal remedies or simply to sit with a cup of tea. Time and gentleness had softened hearts. Not all, but enough. And Eera had found her rhythm. Her days began early, but never rushed. A gentle breeze would stir the curtains as light stretched across her wooden floors. She'd sit by her window, and the same one where a younger version of herself had once prayed for a single friend. Now she welcomed the sunrise with quiet gratitude, and in her heart she often whispered, "Thank you. You heard me?" No face never left. Not truly. The figure didn't always appear in the ways it once had. No illusions, no floating visions or flickers in the night. But there were moments when the wind through the trees would pause in a way that felt like a breath, when the fireflies at dusk would gather in a circle just beyond her reach, when the dreams she dreamt were not memories, but whispers of comfort. Eera had built something from the stillness she was given. A sanctuary, not just for herself, but for others who came with quiet sadness in their eyes. Children who didn't speak much, or widows with too much grief in their hands. To them, she offered a place by the hearth, warm bread, and space to simply exist. And in their company, she laughed. The laugh didn't erupt like thunder. It was softer than that, like the song of a creek through springtime woods. But it was real. It didn't crack under the weight of sorrow or tremble with fear of vanishing. It was rooted now, born from soil that had once been cold and barren, but now bloomed with wildflowers of every color. Some evenings, she would sit outside on her wooden steps as twilight brushed the sky. The stars would blink to life above, and her gaze would wander upward soft and knowing. She'd hum a tune, one with no words, just a melody that belonged to her. Sometimes the breeze would carry it far. Sometimes the wind would return with a harmony that wasn't hers. She smiled always. There was a journal on her table. Its pages were worn, but not with sorrow. They were filled with sketches of the forest, of dreams, of fireflies that once danced like laughter. There were letters written to no one in particular, only signed Eera. And in the final pages, a map, drawn not to escape, but to guide. Paths through forests where light filtered gently. Hills where voices echoed with joy. Lakes that remembered her reflection. She'd begun preparing to teach others how to walk those paths. Not everyone understood the spirit who once sat silently beside her. Some still believed it a tale, an invention of a lonely child. Others, though, swore they'd felt something too. In their loneliest moments, a hush that wrapped around them like safety. Eera never confirmed nor denied. She only smiled, her gaze soft and far away. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms drifted like snow, Eera opened the doors of her cottage to a girl no older than she once was. Pale, silent, holding tight to a worn ribbon. Eera said nothing at first. She simply knelt, offered her hand, and smiled. The girl looked up, and for a moment, something invisible passed between them. The same kind of silence, the same weight. But Eera's touch said everything. "I know," it seemed to say. "I was you, but now I am me." And so began something new. Eera's story did not end in shadows. It carried them, yes, but only so others might walk beside her in the light she had found. The seasons turned as they always did. But now, Eera welcomed their rhythm. like the slow turning of pages in a well-loved book. Where once she had counted winters by the ache in her chest and the silence of her hearth, now she marked time by sunrises shared, gardens grown, and stories passed from one soul to another. Her home, once a sanctuary only for herself, had gently transformed into something more. A haven of healing tucked beneath the canopy of whispering pines. The front gate creaked softly with each arrival, travelers carrying sorrow in their eyes, children with questions they hadn't yet learned to speak, and wanderers seeking a place where silence didn't feel like absence. Eera welcomed them all. She never asked too much, never pressed them to speak. Instead, she offered warmth, the quiet kind that came with the scent of wild mint steeping on the fire, or the way her laughter, gentle and true, filled the spaces between long silences. She taught others how to tend the earth, to breathe slowly, to sit without shame in their sadness. She didn't preach or pretend to be wise. Her wisdom wasn't spoken, it was lived, in the way she paused before picking a flower, in the care with which she folded blankets for her guests, in how she listened even when no words were said. In the evenings, the young girl with the ribbon, her name was Luma, would sit beside Eera beneath the arbor of hanging lanterns. Their shadows stretched long against the garden wall, and Eera would hum a melody she remembered from dreams. Sometimes Luma would hum along, sometimes not. But always she stayed close. The silent bond between them grew like roots, unseen, deep, and strong. Eera told stories now, not loud, embellished ones, but soft ones drawn from memory and quiet magic, of glowing fireflies that once danced in the shape of laughter, of a spirit who never spoke but always stayed, of a girl who cried in the woods and found, instead of an answer, a presence. Each story was told not to impress, but to remind that healing comes slowly, that silence isn't always empty, that pain doesn't vanish, but it can change shape and even give birth to beauty. People came and went, but some stayed longer. They helped build a second cottage just beyond the garden, then a third. A small, gentle community began to take root, one where people honored the quiet as much as the noise, where not every scar had to be explained and no smile was ever demanded. Eera found herself surrounded not by crowds but by connections, and that was enough. There were still nights when she'd walk alone into the woods. The path was familiar, worn by her bare feet over the years. The moonlight would filter through the leaves just as it had when she was young, and sometimes, just sometimes, a shadow would appear beside her. Not heavy, not threatening, just there. She never looked directly at it anymore. She didn't need to. Sometimes she'd whisper, "Thank you," and the leaves would rustle in reply. In her home, a wall had been gently transformed into a mural. It was no masterpiece in the traditional sense, but it lived. Painted by many hands over the years, it depicted Eera's journey, not just her own path, but those she'd helped. A forest glowing gold, a girl reaching for stars, a faceless figure made of soft brushstrokes, always near, never looming. In the mural's corner, she had added one detail herself: a crescent moon over a windowsill, a candle, a stuffed toy, and the eyes of a child who once waited for a friend. That child had grown, not away from the pain, but through it. One spring, Luma began to draw. Her sketches filled Eera's journals, her style loose and dreamy. She showed them to Eera one day, pages of Eera herself standing in moonlight, laughing with her eyes closed, planting seeds under falling blossoms. Eera took the sketches gently in her hands and smiled with something deeper than pride. It was wonder, the kind that asked, "How did we get here?" and then quietly answered, "By staying." She hung the sketches beside the mural, In town, Eera's name was no longer spoken with unease. Children waved when they saw her walking. The baker saved her the last almond pastry. The librarian had given her a small room to keep books and stories in, written by her hand. Some called her the Quiet Flame. Others, simply Eera. One autumn afternoon, she stood on a hill outside the village, the golden fields swaying below. Luma stood beside her now, taller, bolder, still quiet. Eera took a deep breath, letting the wind press gently against her skin. "I think I'm ready," she said softly, the wind carrying the words gently away. Luma looked up at her. "For what?" Eera smiled, eyes glinting with joy. "To tell the whole story." And that was how the book began. Years passed gently, and the world began to know Eera, not as the girl of silence, but as the woman who transformed silence into sanctuary. Her story, once whispered behind curtains and across cobblestone alleys, was now spoken with reverence. Eera, the one who smiled through sorrow, who grew something soft in a world that had once been so hard. By her late 20s, Eera had woven her quiet resilience into something tangible. A center, half community garden, half storytelling house, stood nestled beneath a canopy of silver-leaved trees near the edge of the village. There, children painted memories, elderly villagers told old tales, and travelers lingered for days, pulled in by a peace they couldn't quite explain. No signs marked the building, no fanfare ever introduced it. It simply existed, like No Face once had. Quiet, present, comforting. Inside the center, the floors were always warm, and laughter echoed without urgency. People came with burdens and somehow left just a little lighter. Some would say the wind inside whispered to them. Others claimed the moonlight always landed differently on its rooftop. But most simply called it the Lantern House, because it always glowed, no matter the hour. Eera never claimed to heal others. She didn't wear robes or give speeches. Instead, she listened. She walked beside guests in the garden, offered them tea from old ceramic cups, and sometime, after sunset, she would share one of her stories. But not the whole story. Not the spirit. Not the field of fireflies or the floating illusions. Some things were too sacred, too quiet to be told directly. So instead, Eera told parables about a bird that forgot how to sing, about a girl who found music in wind chimes. And those who listened understood in their own way. They felt something in her pauses, in her gaze that lingered slightly longer on the horizon than most. Behind the house, she built a pond fed by natural spring water. No one else knew this, but every stone along its edge had been gathered from places she once wandered with No Face. She planted weeping willows, their leaves trailing like whispers across the surface. And each year, on the first full moon of spring, she lit a single lantern and floated it across the water in slate dance. No one asked why. But every year, more people came to sit with her beside the pond. Not to speak, just to be. The tradition grew, not out of ritual, but out of reverence for something unnamed. One autumn evening, as golden leaves danced across the twilight sky, a child approached her while she was painting near the garden's edge. He tugged on her sleeve, eyes wide. "Miss Eera, is it true you were once all alone?" She paused. The brush midair, a soft blue smudge lingering between sky and mountaintop on the canvas. "I was quiet," she said gently. "Not alone. Did someone help you?" Eera smiled, not the smile of politeness, but the kind that bloomed slowly from memory. "Yes," she whispered, glancing toward the trees swaying in the distance. "Someone who didn't say a word." The boy looked confused, but not unsatisfied. He nodded and ran off again, chasing shadows with other children. Later that night, as candles flickered across the garden paths, Eera sat beneath her favorite tree with a worn book in her lap. The wind rustled through the branches above. She didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes and listened. There was no voice, no footsteps, no figure seated beside her. But the presence had never really gone. She felt it in the way dusk held its breath before nightfall, in the hush between sentences, in the warmth of firelight on her skin. Even now, grown and strong and joyful, Eera carried No Face within her, not as a ghost of the past, but as a companion in every moment of stillness. He was part of her rhythm, her instinct, her gentleness, the friend who had never asked for anything, who had simply stayed. And in her staying, she now passed that same gift on to others. As seasons folded gently over each other, Eera's life became a quiet constellation of ordinary miracles. The garden thrived, not with showy blossoms or towering hedges, but with herbs and wildflowers, all things gentle and low to the ground. Plants that didn't shout for attention, but released their scent only when touched. She said they were shy things with kind hearts, and perhaps she was one of them. Each morning, Eera walked barefoot through the dewy grass, her fingers grazing the petals as if greeting old friends. Sometimes children would run ahead, pretending to be explorers in a forgotten realm. But when they reached the heart of the garden, the old weeping tree by the spring-fed pond, they always grew quiet. Some said the wind whispered there. Others just knew. This was where you sit with your thoughts. A wooden bench rested under the tree, weathered smooth by years of visitors. People sat there for different reasons, some in grief, others in transition, some not even knowing why they had come. Eera never asked. She only ever joined them if they invited her with a glance. And if they did, she brought 2 mugs of tea, always in silence. It was this silence that became her gift. Not an empty void, but a space where people heard their own hearts more clearly. Eera had long stopped trying to explain what No Face meant to her. Some moments are not meant for language. They are meant to be felt, like the hush before snowfall, or the tremble in your chest when a memory brushes past like a breeze. But she remembered him often, especially on cloudless nights. In the attic of the lantern house, there was a small observatory, a dome with a ceiling that opened to the stars. Few knew of it. Fewer still were invited. It wasn't secret, just sacred. There, Eera kept a journal, not filled with words, but with drawings. Soft charcoal sketches of the memories that mattered most. A girl and a faceless spirit walking beneath a canopy of fireflies. A window with fog outside and a candle still flickering. A lantern drifting across a moonlit pond. Sometimes, when she sat there alone, looking up at the stars, she would close her eyes and whisper, "I remember you." And though no reply ever came, she always felt a stillness settle over the room, as if something unseen had paused to listen. Years continued their gentle turn, and Eera's hair grew longer, streaked with silver at the edges, though her face carried more serenity than age. She became known not for her tragedy, but for her grace, and people sought her not for solutions, but for presence. Writers came to sit in the corner of her sunroom. Painters brought easels to her garden. Grieving hearts wandered in without knowing what they needed. And still, she never claimed to heal them. She simply made space. Space to breathe, to cry, to begin again. One day a young girl arrived, no older than Eera had been when the silence first swallowed her life. She didn't speak for 2 days, just wandered the garden, touched the leaves, sat by the pond. Then on the 3rd morning, she brought Eera a drawing, a faceless figure standing beside a small child beneath the moon. Eera's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the sketch. She looked up, her eyes meeting the girl's. "He comes to others now," she said softly. The girl only nodded. And just like that, Eera knew No Face had never been hers alone. It was something older, something beyond names or forms. A spirit of quiet kindness, a companion to the lonely, a guardian of the still. That night, Eera lit a lantern and placed it on the pond. But this time, she wasn't alone. Dozens of others did the same. The water bloomed with warm, golden lights that drifted together like memories reuniting. As the last lantern floated into the center of the pond, Eera closed her eyes. She didn't need to see him. She already felt him there. In the hush, in the peace, in the way the wind didn't rush, but lingered, as if time itself had paused to honor what had been and what was still to come. And in her heart, untouched and eternal, the smile remained. Years passed quietly, like leaves drifting downstream, never hurried, never still. And through them all, Eera remained the steady light in a world that often moved too fast. Children who once clung to her fingers had grown. Some became travelers, others stayed nearby. Many carried pieces of her with them, small moments that shaped them more than they knew. A quiet walk through fog. A cup of warm tea on a day they didn't know they needed one. The echo of her words. Let silence teach you what noise cannot. Eera never craved recognition. The world didn't owe her attention, and she never asked for it. But something strange happened anyway. Stories about her spread, softly, like secrets passed between dreamers. They said there was a woman who could sit with your sorrow and make it feel like company instead of burden. A woman who never judged, never rushed, and somehow made even silence feel full. Some called her a healer, others a mystic. But to most, she was simply Eera, the girl who had once been forgotten, now unforgettable. And yet she still kept to her rhythm, waking with the sun, feeding the birds, tending her garden. And when night came, she'd light one candle and sit beneath the stars, not to seek answers, but to offer gratitude. It was during one such night that she felt a stirring, not in the air, but within, a knowing. Life, she realized, was preparing to turn another page, not an end, a transformation. She didn't fear it. She welcomed it like an old friend. In the days that followed, Eera began to sort through her journals and sketches. She tied them in bundles with ribbon, each one marked not by dates, but by feelings, for a heart that needs hope, for someone starting over, for the one who has forgotten how to cry. She gave them away quietly, to neighbors, to travelers, to strangers who didn't know why they had knocked on her door. One bundle she left on the bench under the weeping tree. It simply read, "For you, yes you." And then she rested. No drama, no final words, just a closing of eyes under the slow dance of starlight. Her breath softened like a lullaby, and her hands, weathered from years of giving, folded gently over her chest. The lantern on her windowsill, which had flickered for decades, glowed brighter than ever. Not a flame of fire, but a pulse of golden warmth that filled the room and spilled onto the garden. Flowers bloomed in midnight. The weeping tree lifted its branches as if catching a breeze that no one else could feel. And for a moment, just a breath of one, those who stood near swore they saw a figure, faceless, still, standing beside her, not to take her, not to end anything, but to walk with her again, side by side, into whatever waited beyond. The next morning, the village was silent, not with sadness, with awe. Because though Eera's body no longer walked the cobbled paths, her spirit remained in the spaces she had filled with kindness, in the way the garden leaned toward the light, in the hush beneath the weeping tree, in the candle that never seemed to burn out. And in the hearts of those who had met her, Even if only in passing, there lived a knowing. That love does not need to speak. That presence can be a kind of language. That sometimes the quietest souls leave the loudest echoes. Years later, a child wandered into the garden again, guided by a dream they barely remembered. They found the bench, the tree, and a single lantern still resting by the pond. And beside it, carved into the wood in delicate letters, were the words, "You are not alone." The child looked up, eyes wide, and smiled. Somewhere beyond time, a faceless spirit and a girl with a lantern heart watched. Together. Always.